It is, of course, not my first visit to this Amrita University, and as some of you might remember, I have in the past given lectures on various topics related to ancient India or India's cultural heritage. However, this time I thought I would make a different attempt of giving a single taking a single topic and trying to treat it a little more in depth compared to what I used to do before. In fact, I have given, of course, many talks on the Aryan issue, but most of them limited in time to an hour or so. And as you will see, the issue is actually so complex and has so many different aspects that even these 4 to 5 hours, 5 hours perhaps, that I will be devoting to it will not really deal so deeply as I would like, but at least will give you a good idea of what are the different ways to approach the problem. Are there already some solutions? Are there already some answers? In which fields? What methods should we use? And perhaps also we should ask to start with, why is it so important? Why is it that today in India we continue to discuss so much an issue about whether something happened about 3,500 years ago, when, as you will see, we are told that people called the Aryans came into this land. Does it matter so much what happened 3,500 years ago? And perhaps this I may immediately offer a small answer in the sense that problems of history, whatever the date may be, are always intimately related to problems of identity. What are we today? For the simple reason that the past never really dies, and it lives with us. We hold the past within us. Whether we have studied history well or not is quite irrelevant, in fact, but we carry that past in us, and that is why we find all over the world burning issues of identity, ethnicity, linguistic definitions, and ultimately national definitions, which are intimately related to historical issues, such as the one we are going to explore. So let me get started. And the map that you have in front of you is a map which we will be working on today and tomorrow from various angles. And this is the arena northwest of the Indian subcontinent, where I will explain a little more, the importance of the rivers that you see. That is, we will come to it. And this is something that is going to be our arena. What happens in this region about 3,500 years ago, and where many things begin. So in a way, I will be talking about the Aryan problem on the way, and this is perhaps one important outcome of this study. On the way, we are going to examine many aspects that are definitely related to the beginnings of Indian civilization. And many of these aspects actually are non-controversial. So we will also have a much better understanding, and this is one assured outcome of this series, of how this whole Indian civilization began, because many people have the most hazy notions about it. And we will also use issues of methodology. What are the wrong ways to study certain issues, and how certain scholars wittingly or unwittingly make big methodological mistakes when they examine such ancient periods. So how does it all begin? In fact, you have in front of you William Jones, the well-known founder in the late 18th century of the Asiatic Society, founded first of all in Calcutta. And he was a prodigious scholar. He was a judge by profession, but he was a scholar in Hebrew, in Persian, of course, Greek, Latin, French, German, and whatnot, and among the first Europeans who were able to learn Sanskrit. There were a few people before him, in fact, missionaries such as de Nobili, such as the French Jesuit Cordoue, who had already noticed through their limited learning of Sanskrit, that Sanskrit had some strange kinship, likeness with European languages. But it was William Jones in, as you can see, 1786, who had this very famous statement, which I will still read. He said that Sanskrit is of wonderful structure, more perfect than the Greek, more copious than the Latin, more exquisitely refined than either. So high praise of Sanskrit, first of all, but then he notes the connections. And he has immediately this statement, which is very rich in potential, and which says that all three languages, Sanskrit, Greek, and Latin, must have sprung from some common source. So we have here the linguistic issue, first of all. And this is going to guide a lot of the Aryan problem, which is that we have to explain, and I will come to this towards the end of this lecture series, tomorrow afternoon, I suppose. We will have to explain why is Sanskrit, or how did Sanskrit, Greek, Latin, and therefore other European languages from English, German, French, and Russian also, in other Indo-European languages, how do they come to be so intimately related to Sanskrit? And one of the earliest languages which were also noted to be much closer in a way to Sanskrit, was the old Avestan language of Iran, of ancient Iran, in which the Zen Avesta, the Zoroastrian text, was written. So this linguistic statement is of great importance. But then something happens very soon after this, which is unexpected, which need not have happened, and perhaps would not have happened if Europe was not, in the 19th century, shortly after William Jones, was not a field of intensely rising nationalistic entities, like Germany, for example. And we find a few decades later on, the great German Sanskritist and mythologist and philologist, prodigious scholar Friedrich Max Müller, who, after a brief stay in France, where he collected manuscripts of the Rig Veda, moved to Oxford in England and had a prodigious outcome of academic work, in which he collated those manuscripts and gave the world the first printed edition of the Rig Veda, complete with Sayana's commentary. I will return to Sayana a little later. And this was happening in the 1940s or so, suddenly opened a whole new field of scholarship in Europe. And all great scholars looked at this ancient civilization as if waking up in front of them. And they only knew about Egypt, about, of course, Greek civilization. This was fairly familiar. But what about civilizations like India, like China? It was absolute haziness. Now suddenly these publications, and also those of texts like the Upanishads, which actually preceded the publication of the Vedas, and Mahabharata, Ramayana, and Kalidasa, and etc., etc., and little by little, all the great classical texts of India became available in the first half of the 19th century in Europe, and created something of an intellectual revolution, about which unfortunately I will not be able to talk. But this discourse was immediately perverted. Perverted because it was used or misused in a racial context. And Max Müller, though a very great scholar, as I said, immediately took a racial reading of the Rig Veda, which he was compiling, publishing, partly translating also. And he saw the Rig Veda as basically the story of a clash of two races. The indigenous race, which was symbolized, as we will see very shortly, by the Dasyus, the Dasas, some names which occur in the Rig Veda, certain groups of people apparently, and the Aryas who conquer or oppose, clash with the Dasyus and Dasas. So he was not exactly the only one, but then I will not have time to tell the whole story in full detail. For that you may have to wait for my next book. But to simplify, he identified, you see, the Aryas come into India, in his opinion, carrying with them the Sanskrit language, the Vedas, or they are going to compose the Vedas in India. And they therefore are the linguistic bridge between India and Europe. So he does start from a linguistic approach. He wants to explain the connection between the European languages and Sanskrit in India, but immediately after this he gives a racial twist where the Aryas of the Veda become a race, and the Dasyus and Dasa become a kind of an opposing race. And he writes in 1947, he writes how the English descendants of the same Aryan race, so you see the word race being used, to which the first conquerors and masters of India belonged, these are the Aryas, return. They return now under the guise of the British. The British are themselves the descendants of the Aryans, and they come back to India and they accomplish the glorious work of civilization which had been left unfinished by the Aryan brethren. So here we have a very problematic interpretation where from the linguistic problem we have shifted to a problem of race, opposing races, and this interpretation of this racial interpretation of the Veda is now given as a kind of justification for the British conquest of India. And in fact, I will, for lack of time, I will not give you many more quotations, but I could, of how many British scholars will be praising the British conquest of India as nothing more but than a new Aryan wave into India. So in a way, here you see the British conquest being justified as the return of the Aryans to, or a second coming of the Aryans to India, and they have to now complete the task of civilizing India, which the original Aryans, bringing Sanskrit and the Vedas into India 3,500 years ago or so, started. So this is a very, very, very risky interpretation which we will deal with. And this will influence generations of scholars after him who will confuse, and I will return to this a little later, who will confuse the linguistic problem and the racial problem, and they will intermix both in a way which will take decades to unravel, and in a manner which will have tragic consequences in the history of Europe, because the rise of Nazism will be founded on this racial interpretation that there is an Aryan conquering race, it is the master race, Herrenvolk in India, and therefore it has a right, and sometimes a God-given right, as will be said, to dominate the world. So taken to, of course, an extreme which Max Müller did not wish or anticipate, it will become the Nazi ideology of the 20th century. So you see how sometimes scholarly interpretations or misinterpretations can have huge consequences in the very real world. So now let us have, before we proceed, the interpretation of what exactly is stated by the Aryan issue, the conventional, orthodox, mainstream manner in which the Aryan invasion or migration is defined. It is that about 1500 BC, you have people speaking Sanskrit entering India and subjugating whatever indigenous populations are there, imposing their language, so Sanskrit will be spreading, and their culture, which is of course the Vedic culture. They will be composing the Rig Veda, the most ancient of the 4 Vedas, very shortly after their arrival in India. This, I'm giving you the conventional theory as it is. And also the social order, which will become the future caste system, will be also propagated through this invasion. There are 2 forms today. Initially there was only one. Now we have 2 forms of the invasion theory. One is still the hard theory which wants the Aryans to have come as a very aggressive, conquering, warring people. And in some views they will be clashing with the Harappan civilization. We will see shortly why. And they will be responsible for the demise of the Indus civilization. This is, let us say, the hard view of the theory. There is a softer view which does not require the Aryans to have come as a conquering, aggressive, warring people. It does not require also the Aryans to have clashed with the Harappans. They may have entered peacefully into India, but the result is the same. They will propagate their Sanskrit language, their Vedic culture, and their social order ultimately. Then, whichever view you take, the Aryans settle down in the Indus and the Sarasvati valleys, and by 1200 BC or so, they would have composed the Rig Veda. This is the dates that you find most of the time. And then they will proceed further east. You see, and this is a critical step which is often forgotten. They do not stop there. They continue their movement into India, and they penetrate the Gangetic Valley plains further east, cross Yamuna, Ganga, and they find huge kind of virgin forest. They find a heavily forested region which they will deforest or clear, at least to some extent, with the help of their superior iron tools. So this is something which you find in still many texts. And then, as I mentioned, this is a direct interpretation from the Rig Veda, which does mention certain people or entities termed the Dasyus or the Dasas. So the Aryans are subjugating them, and therefore they are regarded as the indigenous people. And described, we will see why very shortly, as dark-skinned and stub-nosed. This is the standard scenario still reflected in many textbooks. In fact, let me show you very briefly a few textbooks, and some of you here may remember learning something like that at school. The pictures you see at the bottom are taken from 2 textbooks used in Tamil Nadu schools in the lower classes, classes 4, 5, 6. And one of them you see in class 4 says, it is believed that the earliest inhabitants of India were the Dravidians, who were the people who lived in Mohenjo-daro. So now this is a new piece of information which we are given, you see, that the people who lived in Mohenjo-daro were the Dravidians. Is it true? Is it not true? We will come to that a little later. The Aryans migrated from Central Asia and drove away the Dravidians after fierce battle. Second piece of information given to class 4 students. You can please figure out the psychological impact upon them, that there were fierce battles between these Aryans and these Dravidians. The culture of the Aryans were entirely different from that of the Dravidians. Third piece of information, that there was a cultural clash between the two. We will take up these elements one by one. If I take quickly some other textbooks, this is from Maharashtra textbooks, class 11. The Indo-Aryans were tall, fair-skinned and handsome. How do they know that they were handsome? I cannot explain it to you, but they were. And they were also tall and fair-skinned. Where is this tallness and fair skin coming from? Simply the 19th century concept propagated in Europe of the Aryan. which as I said, the Nazi ideology will take back and amplify the Aryan as preferably blonde, preferably blue-eyed, preferably tall, etc., etc. We will be given lots of physical characteristics which are lingering in our textbooks till today. This is from West Bengal. The Aborigines, they are not able even to spell the word properly, so we have repeated the spelling as they had it. The Aborigines were black in color, and they got subjected by the white-skinned Aryans or Vedic tribes. So we have now a kind of black and white scenario, you see, where on the one hand you have the black indigenous people and the white Aryans, not only fair skin but white, and this is still taught today in our texts. Tamil Nadu, class 6, the Aryans would have destroyed these towns, that is to say the Harappan towns, in order to succeed. The heap of bones discovered in Mohenjo-daro is evidence of the invasion of the foreigners. So first of all, the Aryans are foreigners. Number 2, they destroy the Indus cities. Number 3, now there are heaps of skeletons. Now we will have to scrutinize that, whether we do find heaps of skeletons. And let me end it. This is not limited to school. Even at university level, lots of textbooks are still replete with these notions, which we have to scrutinize. Like this textbooks of D.N. Jha of Delhi University, Ancient India in Historical Outline, which has been reprinted many times and used in many universities. And D.N. Jha informs us that it is likely that the early Aryans had some consciousness of their distinctive physical appearance. They were generally fair, the indigenous people dark in complexion, so we have again the same contrast of skin color. The color of the skin may have been an important mark of their identity. In other words, the Aryans here are defined in addition by their skin color and therefore their racial features. So you can see how these 19th century concepts of race are still propagated in our textbooks. Whether they are legitimate or not, we will be examining either this afternoon or tomorrow morning, I think tomorrow morning. But then they are still taught, and this is one point I wanted to make. Now, how do we approach this big issue? You see, people rush to many conclusions. They find usually one piece of argument that will raise an objection, and they think that the problem is solved. It is not so simple as that. In fact, to solve the problem, we have to solve every approach to the problem. Otherwise, we have not solved the problem. So the first approach is, of course, the literary. That is to say, we have to look at the text. What does the Rig Veda tell us? Because that is how the problem began. And we have to see whether the Rig Veda justifies the kind of interpretations that have been propagated. Number 2, geography. I showed you the map, my very first slide. That map tells us a lot, and I will show you how. Number 3, archaeological, because the problem is very simple from an archaeologist's point of view. We are told that the Aryans enter India. They are a new people. They bring a new culture. This is what the textbooks say. Therefore, they would have brought new objects, new type of pots, new forms of art, new objects of daily use, and possibly new weapons, because they are said to have come as conquerors, they are aggressive and so on. And as you will see later, they're said to have come with their horses. In fact, you could see in the images of the Tamil Nadu textbooks, which I had kept at the bottom, they come on horseback or they come in horse carts. That also would leave traces. So, from an archaeologist's point of view, if the theory is true, we should be able to find some evidence, some relic, some archaeological record of it. This will be the third approach. The fourth is cultural, because we are told that there is a cultural clash, that their culture of the incoming Aryans is clashing with that of the indigenous people. Whether they are Dravidians or not is another issue, but they are coming to impose their culture, Vedic-based culture, on the subcontinent. So we have to examine this whether there is evidence of such a cultural clash. Fifth is anthropological and genetic, because, once again, if a new people comes into India, then by studying, that is the job of bioanthropology, by studying the skeletons of that period, a little bit before, a little bit after, if possible, we should know whether there is some kind of a discontinuity. And lastly, genetics in recent years has started studying what is known as population genetics. And when it deals with the ancient period, it is also known as archaeogenetics, to try and find whether there is an addition to the Indian gene pool around 1500 BC, which could be traceable to the arrival of a new people. So this is also an important approach. Astronomical, I will explain why. I will not spend time on it now. And finally, I've kept it for the last, the issue that started the whole problem, that we do need to explain this linguistic kinship as part of what is now called the Indo-European family of languages. So this is what I propose to do today, and if time permits, I will even add one or two minor approaches like evidence from agriculture, from metallurgy, and possibly a few more details. But we will see as we proceed. Now, let me start with the literary evidence. And I'm afraid I will have to read out a few quotations here and there. So therefore, I will request your patience, because the argumentation is not so simple as we might think. So we have to look at it in some depth. Otherwise, we will remain in confusion as to whether those Aryans in the Rig Veda do clash with these so-called Dasyus. Now, there are people in India who read the European theories of the 19th century. For example, Swami Dayananda Sarasvati of Arya Samaj, the founder of Arya Samaj, read and protested. He said, well, I don't see anything like that in the Rig Veda. He has not elaborated the whole argumentation, so I only mention him. But perhaps the second great figure, in fact, there are quite a few. I'm only using 3 for lack of time. The second great figure to object to the European scenario is Swami Vivekananda. And in 1897, in fact, even a little earlier, when he was confronted, you see, the problem that the Europeans were having after agreeing more or less on the framework of the theory, was to pinpoint the place of origin of the Aryans. Where did they come from? Were they coming from Central Asia? Were they coming from the Black Sea? Were they coming from these Russian steppes? Or were they coming from Germany, as some people proposed? So all these issues need to be addressed. And there was a huge amount of disagreement. The Germans wanted the Aryan homeland to be in Germany. Once upon a time, the Russians wanted it to be in Russia, and so on and so forth. And Swami Vivekananda said, according to some, they came from Central Tibet. Others will have it that they came from Central Asia. Of late, there was an attempt made to prove that the Aryans lived on the Swiss lakes. I should not be sorry if they had been drowned there, theory and all. Some say now that they lived in the North Pole. Lord bless the Aryans and their habitations. As for the truth of this theory, there is not one word in our scriptures, not one, to prove that the Aryan came from anywhere outside India. Now, this is a very strong statement. What does it say? Apart from the irony of all these conflicting hypotheses about the Aryan homeland, what it tells us is that there is nothing in the scriptures, in the Vedas, to justify this migration of Aryans into India. So this is the first statement of this kind. And he continues, what your European pundits, he was actually speaking abroad, I believe.
say about the Aryans swooping down from some foreign land, snatching away the land of the Aborigines, and settling in India by exterminating them is all pure nonsense, foolish talk, and all those monstrous lies are still being taught to our boys. So you see that he completely rejects the whole Aryan scenario, and he complains that it is still, that is 1901, we are 2015, he complains that they are still taught, and they are still taught today. So we haven't progressed much from that point of view, and but then this is the first someone well-argued refutation of the Aryan issue, based exclusively on the fact that Rig Veda doesn't justify this interpretation. The next is Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo went further because he spent a long time, many years in fact, studying the Rig Veda and trying to understand what it really meant. Rig Veda, for those who are not familiar with it, is the most ancient Sanskrit text in India. And it is basically a collection of hymns. It is simply rishis singing hymns in praise of various gods and goddesses. Nothing else. For what purpose exactly is a matter of interpretation. What do they expect from those gods and goddesses, and what is their worldview, and what is their philosophy, what is their spirituality, if any, is another issue. But this is the text that Max Muller and others were trying desperately to extract history from. History, you see, an invasion of Aryans into India is a historical event. So this is the problem which people like Sri Aurobindo confronted, and he said, first of all, this is a very insightful statement of his. He said race, referring to the concept of an Aryan race, is a thing much more obscure and difficult to determine than is usually imagined. In dealing with it, the transient distinctions current in the popular mind are wholly out of place. This is a fantastic statement because it's made in 1915. And he's already anticipating the misuse of the race concept, which is going to grow and grow, as you can remember now, into Germany, pre-Nazi Germany. This whole Aryan race will be inflated until it became what we know. So this is very insightful, and it is unfortunate that, you know, scholars, either Indian or European, did not listen to such people because they had their own wisdom. They were not holding PhDs from any university, but they had their own deep understanding and insights. Then the racial identification of supposed Aryans and non-Aryans is a conjecture supported only by other conjectures, a myth of the philologists. So he complains that philologists, that is to say linguists like Max Muller, created this myth. He does not deny the linguistic connection, but then he says it is not justified to explain it by this theory. There is no actual mention of such an invasion in the Rig Veda. There is no reliable indication of any racial difference between the Aryans and the Dasyus. So this is also very important. He challenges the Western scholarship that reads such a racial difference and reads such a invasion in the Rig Veda. And he said, if you read the Rig Veda closely, you do not find any such thing. So finally, he proposed a completely new interpretation of the Rig Veda, which was not at all based on any historical event like the Aryan invasion, but purely based on what were the rishis trying to achieve, what was their whole effort, what was their quest. And to him, it was essentially a spiritual quest. I will not be able to develop his theory for lack of time. It is not directly relevant to the Aryan issue, except that at least he showed that you can read the Rig Veda very differently if you wish, and you can understand the whole Vedic symbolism at a completely different level, which is not at all the historical level of the 19th century. The third great scholar, not the third because there were several others, not only in India, even abroad, but as I said, I selected only three, is
Ambedkar. Dr. Ambedkar, I don't have to introduce him. You all know his work for the depressed caste, as they were called at that time, and the untouchables, as they were called at that time. And you know that today this is still a big issue in Indian society. But you will find many of the, let us say, pro-Dalit scholars or speakers basing themselves on the Aryan invasion theory to say that we Dalits are the original inhabitants of India, and all the higher castes are descendants of the incoming Aryans. So we are the original. We have, pride of place in this country. And it's unfortunate that they have not even read Ambedkar himself, because he opposed the whole theory, in fact. And he says that in a book called Who Are the Shudras, he's trying to answer who are the Shudras, who are this fourth caste of, the Shudras are the caste of the workers, the craftsmen, etc. And he writes, the theory of Aryan invasion is an invention. It is a perversion of scientific investigation. It is not allowed to evolve out of facts. The Aryan race theory is so absurd that it ought to have been dead long ago. But far from being dead, the theory has a considerable hold upon the people. So this is a very important statement. And he now goes into details. He says, number one, the Vedas do not know any such race as the Aryan race. So he completely rejects the racial reading of the Rig Veda as Swami Vivekananda and Sri Aurobindo had done. Number two, there is no evidence in the Vedas of any invasion of India by the Aryan race and its having conquered the Dasas and Dasyus, supposed to be the natives of India. So you see that he completely disagrees with this notion. There is no evidence to show that the distinction between Aryans, Dasas and Dasyus was a racial distinction. Fourth, the Vedas do not support the contention that the Aryas were different in color from the Dasas and Dasyus. So where did they get this notion of color from? I will come to that just now. Lastly, from this it follows that if the Brahmins are Aryans, the untouchables are also Aryans. 1949. This is a very strong and astounding statement. If the Brahmins are Aryans, the untouchables, today we call them Dalits. Gandhi called them, of course, the Harijans, are also Aryans in that case. And this would seem to knock the whole theory, to knock the bottom of the whole theory, which still today many advocates of Dalit causes base themselves on. So this is the kind of ironies we have in India, that people do not spend time studying what really is at the root of the causes that they adopt, and they rush to whatever is convenient for their ideology or for their activism. Now, about this question of blackness, because we have in the Rig Veda the notion that the Dasyus, the Dasas are associated with darkness or blackness. It is true, there is some association. But the Canadian archaeologist and Indologist George Erdosi explains, and he explains that the evidence of the characterizations of Dasas and Dasyus as black is tenuous in the extreme. Even apparently clear indications of historical struggles between dark aborigines and Arya conquerors turns out to be misleading. The hymns neither use language or race as markers of ethnic affiliation, nor refer explicitly to a home outside South Asia. Instead of such traits, it is adherence to social and religious norms which were required of Aryas. Now this is very important. It tells us that in the Veda, the distinction, and this is a point that actually Sri Aurobindo also made, distinction between Aryas and Dasyus, what makes them different is not race, it is simply a religious or cultural definition, nothing else. About dark skin, these are the terms which are used. Krishna Garbha, Krishna Twak.
And these terms, which do come a few times in the Rig Veda, actually means Krishna Garbha means wrapped in darkness. Krishna Twach means a dark envelope. And this is what scholars today agree upon. So what we have is simply the fact that these Dasyus, which are actually regarded as creatures of darkness, they are not black-skinned. There is nowhere in the Rig Veda a single statement that the Dasyus have a black skin or that the Aryas have a white skin either. This is a complete fabrication. Or let us say a very free interpretation which, will have the tragic consequences that we know. In fact, Sri Aurobindo, if I just mention one aspect of his symbolic interpretation of the Rig Veda, is that one of the important elements of the quest of the rishis is light. Light, and it comes again and again in the Rig Veda. So it comes as light of truth, Ritasya Jyotish, immortal light, Jyotir Amritam, or the Aryan light, Jyoti Aryam, etc. So this obsession with light is what gave the European scholars in the 19th century the wrong notion that there was a black and white contrast between the Aryas and the Dasyus. There is no such contrast. It is simply what every mythology in the world concentrates upon. You can read the Greek mythology, you can read the Egyptian mythology. All those who are seen on the side of the gods are always invariably associated with the light. And all those, whether demons, whether creatures who oppose the former category, are invariably associated with the darkness. There is nothing special about the Rig Veda in this, and it was a huge scholarly mistake, which is now readily admitted by scholars of every position, good scholars I mean. Whatever they stand on the Aryan invasion or migration, they readily accept that this was an abusive interpretation. Let me quote Heinrich Hock, an American scholar. He is a Sanskritist as well as a linguist, and he, by the way, maintains the Aryan migration theory. Nevertheless, he is a good scholar, and therefore he knows that those interpretations are illegitimate. And he says, a closer examination suggests an alternative interpretation of the terms black or dark as referring to the dark world of the Dasas, Dasyus, in contrast with the light world of the Aryans. An interpretation which is in perfect agreement with the contrast between good light and evil dark forces that pervades the Vedas and has parallels in many, perhaps most other traditions around the world. The evidence of the Rigvedic passages just examined thus does not establish a difference in race or phenotype between Aryas and Dasa Dasyus. This is in 2005, recent statement. And therefore you see that even a good scholar who supports the Aryan migration rejects the racial interpretation of it. And he will confine himself in his case purely to the linguistic argument, which we will see tomorrow. So therefore this, and incidentally, he is not saying anything different from what Sri Aurobindo himself said earlier, except that he's a prominent academic, and therefore he will be quoted and cited, and I hope so. Whereas people like Swami Vivekananda or Sri Aurobindo, unfortunately, were not given the same attention. Now we come to the question of stub-nosed. You will find in many textbooks, and this is mentioned by it was in fact Max Müller who started this, that the Dasyus in the Rig Veda are described as stub-nosed. So they are not only black, which has been now discredited, but they are stub-nosed. Why are they stub-nosed? Because there is one word in the Rig Veda which is anasa, one in the entire Rig Veda of 1028 hymns. There is one word which occurs once, which is anasa, and which Max Müller chose to interpret as anasa, therefore knows less. And from this, it was deducted, all this
just out of a single occurrence of one word, it was deduced that the Dasyus were stub-nosed, had no nose, and therefore they were Dravidians. Why did somebody decide that South Indians had no nose worth the name? I do not know. But this was the assumption made, that South Indians did not have a proud nose as the North Indians had, and therefore this is the description of them in the Rig Veda. You can see how the whole argument is so overstretched and overinterpreted. In fact, Sayana, the great Vedic commentator of the Vijayanagar Empire, about 14th century, the Vijayanagar emperors wanted a complete commentary on the Rig Veda, an interpretation on the Rig Veda. So they asked for a team of scholars headed by Sayana to give an extensive commentary on the Rig Veda, which was done. And in this, it's a very ritualistic interpretation, that is its limitation, but in any case, it's a very important text, because every single word in the Rig Veda, many of these words, have not passed into classical Sanskrit. It's an archaic form of Sanskrit. And so many of these words are discussed at length by Sayana and his team. So it is a very useful text in any case. And Sayana, coming to Anasa, said it is An-asa. Asa is a word for mouth. So they are not noseless, they are mouthless. What does mouthless mean? It means that they cannot speak properly. And this is in fact the important, and this is confirmed in many passages in the Rig Veda, and this is what again Hawk points out here. He says that they are the ones who cannot utter the mantras properly. Their speech is blurred. This is called as Amrita Vacha. They have a blurred speech. They cannot pronounce the mantras properly. So it is a cultural difference. This is what he explains here. It is essentially a cultural difference. Now there is another point which we will confront when we come especially to archaeology, which is that Indra in Rig Veda is known as Purandara. Purandara means the destroyer of Pur. But what is Pur? Now, again in the 19th century, it was assumed that Pur meant a fortress, and that the indigenous people had kind of fortresses, forts, or anyway fortified settlements of some kind. And the Aryas came and destroyed these. We will see very shortly how useful this became to another misinterpretation later on. But we have a problem here, that the text, the Rig Veda, does not allow you ever to interpret it in a very obvious and straightforward manner. You can always have a freedom of interpretation. And Western scholars, in fact, some of them read that the Purs were massive fortresses made of stone, while others read exactly the opposite, that they were very humble rural settlements defended by simply a palisade of wood or mud. So it is not very clear. Secondly, the gods, like Agni especially, also the Maruts, sometimes Indra, the goddesses, the rivers like Sarasvati, are invoked as Pur. They are themselves Pur. Or they are asked to transform us into Pur. So it is a very strange thought, that a god is praised as a fort or as a fortress, or is asked to turn us into fortresses. Now very clearly there is another more symbolic meaning there, and this is what a number of scholars have understood. Even MacDonald and Keith, at the beginning of the 20th century, the authors of the famous Vedic Index, proposed that it was probably only a metaphorical notion and not something to be taken physically. Georges Erdossi, whom I earlier mentioned, said it is clear that the forts belong to the realm of mythology, while Nicholas Kazanas, a Greek Vedic scholar,
said that it is nothing but a supernatural, occult or magical protective force or field. So I am showing you this first of all because it's going to play a very important part very shortly. Secondly, it shows you how extremely different interpretations you can have of the same words in the Rig Veda. And this is in fact the root of the problem, that Rig Veda is not a text of philosophy that expounds concepts like the Upanishads do, for example. It is a completely metaphorical text. These are songs, these are hymns which use a heavy dose of symbolism, and depending on what you are determined to read in the Rig Veda, your interpretations will come out very differently. Finally, to close this first aspect of the Aryan problem, the literary aspect, the texts, what about the texts from South India? Because remember what I showed you earlier, some want that the indigenous people were Dravidians, and that it was the Dravidians whom the Aryans clashed with when they entered India. This, of course, you will find mostly in Tamil Nadu. But still a few other scholars, like Irfan Habib or like D.N. Jha and others, still propose that. And therefore, if that is true, you would normally expect that the earliest Tamil literature should reflect some memory of this event, because after all, it would be at the very root of the movement of the Dravidians to South India and the resettlement in South India. And what do we find in the Tamil Sangam literature, which, as you would know, most of you, is the earliest literature of South India. It is in a form of now archaic Tamil or classical Tamil, and the dates are a little bit controversial. Some scholars want the dates to be 200 or 300 BC, the earliest dates of those collections of poems, while other scholars would rather go to 200, 100 or 200 AD. So the dates do not concern us here. It doesn't really matter. But the point is that you cannot find in any of those texts the memory of a clash with the Aryans coming into India. There is no such recollection. And in fact, T.R. Sesha Iyengar, a Tamil scholar, wrote in 1925, in the oldest extant Tamil classics, there are no traditions pointing to a home outside the Tamilagam. Tamilagam is the Tamil land. Now this is very strange because it's exactly what we saw in the Rig Veda. Rig Veda does not remember any homeland outside India. It does not remember any migration of a people into India. And the Tamil literature similarly does not remember any migration of South Indians from the north. So is it not peculiar that these two peoples who are supposed to have clashed in the third millennium BC, rather second millennium BC, these two peoples are being struck by amnesia somehow and are unable to give us the smallest recollection or nostalgic statement about their original homelands. This is very peculiar. Further, we would expect that the Dravidians would have, if they had been driven south by the incoming Aryans, the normal thing to expect in any kind of cultural clash is that they would have turned to demonizing the culture which drove them out of their homeland. And you would have very hostile statements towards the Vedic gods, goddesses, texts, and so on. This is exactly the opposite which happens. And you find from the earliest layers of the Sangam literature, for example, you take a collection of poems like the Purananuru, which is regarded as among the most ancient, you find exactly the opposite. You find that Vedic gods like Indra, like lots of them, I will mention a few later on, Agni, Shiva, Vishnu, all of them in fact are highly praised. The Vedas themselves are highly praised. The chanting of the Veda is always revered and regarded as very holy. The Vedic sacrifices, the fire rituals, all this is held in the highest respect. And it would be extremely surprising if the Dravidians, or the authors, let us say, the authors of this earliest Tamil literature had come to South India as a result of a major clash with the incoming Aryans. There is something totally unnatural here. So taking the Purananuru, as I mentioned, you have praises of Shiva, Vishnu, Lakshmi under the name of Thiru, mentions of Indra, Arundhati, the Pandavas, the Kauravas, Rama, Sita, the whole of North Indian or Vedic as well as late Vedic and epic culture, epic meanings of course Mahabharata and Ramayana, seems to have traveled to the south, but not at all in any conflictual context. Quite the opposite, in a context of great admiration, great enthusiasm, and a desire to assimilate it. So if I take a scholar like Nilakanta Shastri, the famous historian of South India, his text on the history of South India is still a classic and one of the best you can get. He writes, there does not exist a single line of Tamil literature written before the Tamils came into contact with, and let us add, accepted with genuine appreciation, the Indo-Aryan culture of North Indian origin. Another very strong statement, which all our so-called Dravidianists, whatever they mean by that term, absolutely ignore, resolutely ignore, because it would knock the bottom out of their political ideology, which wants at any cost a climate of hostility between North Indian culture rooted in the Vedas and South Indian supposedly non-Vedic culture. Now it is true that if you read the Tamil literature, it is by no means identical with the North Indian Sanskrit literature. It has its own differences, it has its own techniques, it has its own concepts, it has its own concerns. But a different orientation of literature does not mean that the culture is different. The culture is basically full of acceptance, as I said, of the Vedic and late Vedic elements. So this is something that unfortunately the Dravidian ideology, which is, as you know, a political ideology, has never taken an honest look at. Now I move to the second aspect of my exploration, and that will be the geography. And about this, this is an aspect which is not commonly dealt with, but it is equally important. And we start with the geography of the Rig Veda. Now, Rig Veda, as I said, is a book of poetry. It is not a textbook of history, definitely not, and people have erred by looking at it as a book of history. It is not that. It is also not a book of geography. Nevertheless, it gives us a few elements. First of all, the presence of Samudra, the ocean. Samudra technically can mean any body of water where the waters meet. This is what Samudra means, the meeting of waters. But there are also descriptions of ships with hundreds of oars sometimes, descriptions of storms, descriptions of sailing waves, and all of this is incompatible with a small lake. So certainly the Rig Veda knows the ocean, and this is another paradox to some extent, because if you now picture again the Aryans as coming into India from somewhere in Central Asia, so they cross the Khyber Pass and they come into the Indian subcontinent, how come, and then they stop at the Indus Sarasvati region. I am coming to the Sarasvati in a moment, and they sit down and they compose the Vedic hymns. This is the standard scenario. How come that they are so familiar with the ocean, which is at least 1,500 kilometers away? So this is not easy to explain by the Aryan migration theory. Secondly, what is then the theatre of the Rig Veda? It is the Sapta Sindhava. It is the only region explicitly mentioned several times in the Rig Veda. Sapta Sindhava, 7 rivers. What are those 7 rivers? Well, in the 19th century alone, there was a consensus reached by many scholars that it referred to the Indus in the west, the 5 tributaries of the Indus, and the Sarasvati in the east. Why Sarasvati in the east? I'm coming to right now. But there is another region which is well understood in the Rig Veda, and it is Irina. Irina is what becomes the run of Kutch. In fact, the word run is itself derived from Irina. There's a beautiful work by Professor Aryan and the late geologist Dr. Radhakrishnan on the identification of Irina with the run of Kutch. And that explains, incidentally, why the Vedic people are so familiar with Samudra, with the ocean. So this is the second element. And as I said, this extensive geography is not easily compatible with a few nomadic tribes entering the subcontinent a couple of centuries earlier. We do have a geographical paradox. Now, there is luckily one hymn in the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda. You know that Rig Veda is organized in 10 books. There are 2 ways to organize the Rig Veda, but one of them is in 10 mandalas. And in the 10th mandala, which is admittedly a little bit more recent than the others, you have the Nadistuti Sukta, which is a hymn in praise of rivers. And this is an extract of it, where you can see I have highlighted in red the names of the rivers, and you can see 2 things. Number 1, the rivers begin with Ganga. However, don't think that Ganga is of great importance in the Rig Veda, not at all. Ganga is possibly the only time here, it is possibly the only time when Ganga is mentioned. It is a river of no particular importance in the Rig Veda. It is obviously on the borderline, the eastern borderline of the Vedic world. Then we move to Yamuna, Gange, Yamuna, Sarasvati. Now Sarasvati comes in. Shutudri is nothing but Satluj. Shutudri in the Veda becomes Shatadru in the Mahabharata. And from Shatadru we have the etymology going on to Satluj and so on. So then Parushni, which is the Ravi, Ashikni, which is the Chenab, and it goes on, and you can see Sindhu, which is Indus, of course. Kubaya is the Kabul river. In fact, the word Kabul, the name Kabul comes from Kubaya. Gomatim is the Gomal river. Krumum is the Kumal, and so on. So let me put this on a map, and this is the map of this particular mantra of the Nadistuti Sukta, which continues, it goes on, and it has more rivers listed. But if you see them, they are very clearly listed from east to west, starting from Ganga and ending with the Kabul, Kuram and Gumal tributaries, Afghan tributaries of the Indus. Now, first of all, it's quite remarkable that the Rishi who composed this hymn was able in just one mantra to sweep through the entire northwest of the subcontinent in the correct order. Today, if you ask our school children to just without thinking give us let us say starting from the Narmada river and list all the rivers down to Kaveri, I don't think many would be able to list them in the correct order. So without Google Earth, this Rishi was able to give the whole sweep in the right order. This is one thing. Secondly, it does put us in front of a problem which is never answered. And the problem is this: imagine now that the Aryans did come either invading or migrating into India. They would be coming through this is the Khyber Pass here, you see. They would have come through the Khyber Pass and they would have followed a path more or less like this, finally coming to the Sarasvati, and later on, as I said, later on penetrating into the Gangetic plains. This is what the mainstream theory tells us. Why in that case, should they be listing the rivers from east to west? They should have listed them from west to east in the order in which they encountered them. It stands to reason. So we do have a paradox here. And also the fact that the Sarasvati is now putting us in front of another issue altogether. You see the Sarasvati on my map, but why am I putting the Sarasvati here? What is it that leads me to draw the flow of the river here when actually there is no river today flowing there? Well, this was the question that confronted the 19th century Vedic scholars like Max Muller, like Wilson and several others as to where is this Sarasvati, what is this Sarasvati, which is actually one of the most highly praised rivers in the Rig Veda. The word Sarasvati occurs 72 times in the entire Rig Veda. And Sarasvati is praised sometimes as a river, sometimes as a goddess, and she is the only river to be deified. Sindhu is not deified. Other rivers are not treated as gods or goddesses. Only Sarasvati. It is obviously the origin of the later Indian tradition of regarding all rivers as goddesses. You know, Ganga, Yamuna, Narmada, all of them, Kaveri also, all of them are goddesses. So this is the origin of it. So sometimes as a river, sometimes as a goddess, sometimes as both. But Sarasvati is very highly praised in Rig Veda. And yet, where is that river? It is not there on our maps, even though I have put it somehow. So we have to examine the question of the Sarasvati. And we can go, first of all, as a matter of introduction, we can go with some British maps. The earliest I found was 1760. A map where here in Haryana, you have a Sarasvati river. Of course, those at the back seats may not be able to see well. And it meets a river called the Gagar. Now, what is the Sarasvati? What is the Gagar? Well, there are obviously rivers flowing at that time but by those names. Let us proceed. There is later on a map by James Rennell, who was the Surveyor General of India. You know that the British, as they were conquering, they were at that time very busy conquering India, region after region, province after province. And one important tool of conquest is geography. Unless you know well the region that you want to conquer, you may be, committing some very serious strategic errors. So they were very keen on surveying, mapping, exploring. And this is why we have so much of documentation, of course, from those days. So this map by James Rennell, who is sometimes be called the father of Indian geography because, well, of course, it is the British who call him that, because he produced a lot of excellent maps. And I was able to photograph this map in the Sarasvati Mahal Library and in Tanjavur. And you see here the Sarasvati River joining the Gagar again. This is the whole region of what is today Haryana, Punjab and Rajasthan. So what exactly is happening? What is happening is that when surveyors, topographers, geographers went to those regions, they found that there was a huge dry bed in the region, which was known as Gagar, and in the upper reaches of it, there are several tributaries, one of which is called Sarasvati. Now, this is today a seasonal river. Seasonal, even though during very good monsoons, it will still flow almost all the way to the international border. But most of the time, there is hardly any water except in the upper reaches. So that river is a system which today is called the Gagar system, and there is a Sarasvati tributary. Now, these are some of the explorers in the 1820s and 30s and 40s. They were basically military people because the British were trying to look at an alternative route to invade Sindh. They were not yet in possession of Sindh or Punjab. Now Punjab was barred to them because of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. It would have been very difficult to cross Punjab to invade Sindh. So one alternative route which they found was the dry bed of the Ghaggar. And that is why they sent all these officials exploring it, and they made a number of very interesting observations. One was that this dry bed of the Ghaggar was very wide, and it was dotted with ancient ruins. We are coming back to that this afternoon. A local tradition according to which the drying up of the river caused the region's desolation. So there is a memory, a tradition, that there was once upon a time a massive river flowing there in this huge bed. Thirdly, presence of freshwater wells along the Ghaggar's bed, even though it is now a seasonal river, most of the time not flowing, like in northern Rajasthan, for example. Nevertheless, you have freshwater wells all along the bed, which was mentioned specifically in those military reports as a great advantage in case an army had to move from Delhi to Sindh through the Ghaggar bed. This would have been a great advantage. By the way, the British never used that route eventually because Maharaja Ranjit Singh died, and then his whole empire or kingdom collapsed, and the British were able to invade first of all Punjab fairly easily and then Sindh. So they didn't have to use that route, but they had spotted it. And finally, there is a seasonal river called Sarasvati, as we saw on those maps, among the Ghaggar tributaries. Now this gentleman, who is a French geographer, his name is Louis Vivien de Saint-Martin, was the first to put two and two together. And he said, look here, he was aware of the work of the European Indologists like Max Müller and others. He was also aware of the exploratory work of officials whom we saw earlier, like Todd, Colvin and Mackesson. And he put two and two together in a book written in 1855. Now the date is important. 1855, he wrote a book on the geography of and the primitive people of India's northwest according to the Vedic hymns. And what he said was, you see, he was a geographer and he was an expert in the most remote and desolate regions of the world. He had published many important atlases and documents and so on. And he said, look here, we have the hymns that tell us that there is a Sarasvati between Yamuna and Satluj. Please remember the Nadistuti Sukta, Gange, Yamuna, Sarasvati Shutudri, right? So Sarasvati comes between Yamuna and Satluj. And at the same time, he found that there is there a dry bed of the Ghaggar with a tributary which is called Sarasvati, which is obviously a corruption of Sarasvati. There is no dispute about that. So he said, obviously, this bed of the Ghaggar, whose extension into Pakistan, by the way, is known as the Hakra, this bed is nothing but the relic of the ancient Sarasvati. And he published his result in 1855, which was widely accepted almost immediately by all the Western Indologists, and they had no problem whatsoever accepting that this Ghaggar was the Sarasvati of the Vedic texts. Now this is important because even today our very ignorant media in India continues to propagate theories that Sarasvati is not located, we have to search for the Sarasvati, finding the Sarasvati and so on and so forth. But the whole identification of the river was done and completed in the 19th century. And in fact, you can see this reflected in many other maps, like 1862 in a book of history of India by Henry Beveridge. You can see here, I have blown up this area, you can see the same Sarasvati as a tributary of the Ghaggar. Then it becomes explicitly the Sarasvati. Sarasvati in Alexander Cunningham's book of 1878. Alexander Cunningham, for those who don't know, was the founder of the Archaeological Survey of India. Very solid scholar, expert in the ancient geography of India. In fact, that is the title of his book. And though a very hard-working explorer of India's archaeological sites, I mean, the Archaeological Survey of India is very much, in many ways, his own creation, and with his own contributions. And here he spots the Sarasvati as a tributary of the Gargara, so the Gaga River. This continues. This is a French book, 1881, where you have the Sarasvati and the Gagar bracketed together, so the identification between the two is quite clear. This is C.F. Oldham, who was a surgeon, major in the Indian Army, and in 1883 he wrote a paper studying the whole course of the Sarasvati from the Shivalik hills. Here you cannot see, I should have written here, this is Sarasvati, and this is the Gagar, which continues as Hakra and continues all the way to the Ran of Kutch here. And so therefore a long, very long bed of a vanished river. And he writes, by the way, he writes that although the river below the confluence with the Gagar is marked in our maps as Gagar, it was formerly the Sarasvati. That name is still known amongst the people. He's using the local tradition of this name of the Sarasvati present as a tributary of the Gagar. So this in 1883, there is no question of searching for the Sarasvati today, as you can see. And this is later on accepted by almost every Indologist. But then the story is much more interesting than this. It is not just in the Rig Veda that the Sarasvati is mentioned. It is also in all the post-Vedic literature. For example, in the commentaries known as the Brahmanas. Brahmanas are commentaries on the Vedas, which are probably of the same age as the Upanishads, more or less. And the Brahmanas also mention the Sarasvati. However, there is one huge difference between Rig Veda and the Brahmanas. In the Rig Veda, the Sarasvati is unbroken from the mountain to the sea. Giribhya samudrat. The Sarasvati flows from the mountain to the sea in the Rig Veda. Whereas in the Brahmanas, the Sarasvati is broken up. It disappears at a certain point, and that point is called, as you can see here, Vinashana. Vinashana, of course, means disappearance, loss. It is also called Adarshana, and it shows that something has happened to this river. It has broken up at a certain point, and that disappearance is recorded in the literature. And the later the literature, the more to the east this point of Vinashana has moved. So the river keeps as if receding from stage to stage. In Mahabharata, and this is a map prepared by Jean Filiosa, the great French Indologist. In the Mahabharata, this is a map supposedly of the Mahabharata times. Mahabharata describes the Sarasvati as flowing westward. It flows exactly as the Rig Veda was mentioning, and it is lost in the desert. So then, of course, it builds up many legends to explain why the Sarasvati was lost and so on. That doesn't concern us today. What concerns us is that there is an evolution in the disappearance of the river in the Sanskrit literature. And this is very important because we will see it reflected on the ground this afternoon. So this not only has, this map not only has the Sarasvati, but also another river, Drishadvati, which is also mentioned in the Rig Veda as a tributary of this Sarasvati. So now there is a scholarly consensus, whatever our ignorant media may say, there is a scholarly consensus, and you can see I'm not going to read out all those names of 19th century geographers, geologists, Indologists of all schools of thought agreeing that this must be the relic of the Sarasvati of old. And on the other hand, archaeologists whom we are going to meet this afternoon. But before, well, maybe in that case I should stop here. It is 15 past 12. We will resume this discussion this afternoon, and I will show you why the Sarasvati, it was important to give you this much of background on the Sarasvati, because now it plays a very major role in archaeological investigations and unexpectedly produces an argument against the whole Aryan scenario. So we will continue this afternoon. Thank you very much for your attention.